name's John Follows, and I'm not sure I can compete with some of the stories that Pat has recently recorded, but I'm going to give it a shot and tell you a little bit about my history and my past, and perhaps it may not compete with some of the previous stories, but hopefully it's of some interest. See, I was fortunate in the timing of my short career in two of the air forces of a free world. That was the RAF and the RCAF. I was active in the Royal Air Force from 1954 to 1958, and in the Royal Canadian Air Force from 1958 to 1963, and again in 1966 as a reserve pilot on Beech 18s. So it covered a span of a few years, and this is the story. It was a unique era because it captured the remnants of World War II, particularly in the restoration of Europe, and governments were still funding the military generously. The threat from the USSR was taken very seriously, and excitement and anxiety were prevalent. And yet no bullets were fired in anger. So it was all the fun and excitement without the actual deadly result of warfare. And I can attest to the external carefree attitude of the average pilot, and yet I can confirm his dedication to the professionalism of flying an airplane to every known standards of accuracy and safety. It was an era to be cherished in the history of the RCAF. It was strictly a continuation of the very Canadian quality of proper behavior to difficult tasks. It was demonstrated in a spectacular fashion as recently, of course, as the British Commonwealth Air Training Program of World War II. 1954, I was 19 years old, and I was far more interested in cars and motorcycles than airplanes. I was in the second year of a course in mechanical engineering at Manchester University in the west of England. That's when I discovered the Manchester University Air Squadron. For an undergrad, this was a classy club. It had a bar and it had a lounge, and they paid people to learn to fly. It was too good to be true, so I enrolled immediately. The University Air Squadrons across the country were run by the Royal Air Force for the purpose of recruiting pilots with post-secondary education. And we were granted officer status as pilot officers, and we received the perks that are afforded the officer rank. Conscription for 2-year service in the military was in effect at the time, but membership of a University Air Squadron qualified for full pilot training, which was not available to regular conscripts. Training aircraft were Chipmunks, and they were located at an airfield called Woodvale, which was near Liverpool, and that's not very far from Manchester, and we were encouraged to fly as often as we wished. And in the summers there was a special camp at a specified airfield, which would not have been Woodvale, and there was aerobatic competitions, and I was fortunate to do quite well in those, and we had a lot of fun for those 2 weeks. It was a competition between the different squadrons that belonged to the universities. Out of interest, we still had late model Spitfires that flew out of Woodvale. They performed a high-altitude run across the country to report the weather conditions. And that's what they were used for. And they were kind of amusing. Of course, we didn't have an opportunity to fly them, but we certainly had an opportunity to watch them. That was a motley group of pilots, and there was Squadron Leader Pennington sitting on the top of the airplane with his crew around him. Official pilot training was scheduled after graduation from university, with 2 months boot camp at a place called Curtin Lindsey, which was in Lincolnshire. And from there, we moved on to Provost Aircraft, which was at a different place. It was at a place called Feltwell in Norfolk, because many of World War II airfields were built in Lincolnshire and Norfolk because of the flat topography and the proximity to Europe. The Provost was a replacement for the Harvard, and like the Harvard, had a radial piston engine. It was more modern, and it had side-by-side seating, but fixed landing gear. And although it was pleasant to fly, many thought it was inferior to the Harvard, that it replaced because it did not provide a complete training experience, particularly because the gear was fixed. These were piston Provost aircraft. After the Provost, we moved on to Vampire jets. My instructors, although they were all qualified RAF flying instructors, they had a history of being ex-mercenaries, ferry pilots, and recent RAF squadron pilots from Germany. In Germany, it was relatively unrestricted flying, although there were rules, I'm sure, but they were frequently disobeyed. So some of these instructors had had some fairly hairy experiences in their recent past, and they passed that on to us as students. That's a picture of the T-11 Vampire, which is a dual-seat, dual-control airplane, which was used for all dual instruction on the jet program. That's a single-seater Vampire, which was used for all solo flights. It's FB-5, or Fighter Bomber 5, was its designation. It had no ejector seat, and it had 5 fuel tanks. As the sorties were 45 minutes long, you had to be fairly astute looking at the fuel gauges, otherwise it was quite easy to run low on fuel. At the time, in 1957-58, the RAF did not recognize civilian air traffic. I guess this was a relic from World War II. They insisted on their right to ascend or descend in any way it liked without civilian air traffic control. Although it was not connected, one of our course members, descending in formation through cloud, leveling off at 2,000 feet, he became disorientated and lost control. I remember going to the crash site later and was surprised to find what a huge crater an airplane can cause when it crashes from 2,000 feet. We practiced low flying around 200 feet. That was the legal height limit for practice low flying. I had an instructor. He was an ex-mercenary. He took me down on the deck where the wheat field parted with the wingtip vortex. He said, "Now, that's low flying." He said, "You pull the stick back to clear the hedge, and you shove the nose down again when the hedge is behind you." And that's what he did. It was quite an education. These are single-seater Vampire jets. It ended in graduation. Wings were awarded, and that was the end of the RAF course. Around this date, in early 1958, the RAF decided to eliminate many of the fighter squadrons. These were mostly Hunter aircraft squadrons, and they were mostly stationed in Germany. The reason they cancelled them, of course, was they wanted to rely on missile defense. This was the current thinking of the time. Anyway, one of my instructors, he was a Canadian on exchange to the RAF. He invited me to come to Canada and join the RCAF. At the time, it seemed the most logical and sensible thing to do. There were no fighter airplanes left in the UK, but we had the Arrow in Canada. So I came to Canada to fly the Arrow. I followed his advice and left the RAF to join the RCAF. And because of the decision by the authorities in the RAF, most of my teammates or course mates from the UK went on to fly the V-bombers because there weren't too many fighter appointments left. Anyway, I flew to Canada in a DC-6 via Shannon Island, the Azores, Goose Bay, and Montreal. And that was a stripped down DC-6. It didn't have comfortable seating, but you could see the hot exhaust as it flew through the night. It was a noisy airplane, but it got us there. So I ended up in Montreal and took a train to Centralia with 2 months acclimatization with the RCAF. After Centralia, we were sent to Moose Jaw. It was the middle of winter. Moose Jaw's Moose Jaw. The idea was that I was going to be put through a basic training program, which worked out essentially the same as the British Commonwealth training plan that had been in existence for many years. Flight line at Moose Jaw. As I was being trained to fly the Arrow, Edie had become part of my life. I assumed because of my budding opportunity with the Arrow that the RCAF had provided Edie. She was a nurse and she was quite capable of looking after me. I moved on to Gimli after the Harvard program to fly T-33s. Edie came to see me for a weekend on Winnipeg Beach, which was kind of a fun resort close to Gimli. But she was a Saskatchewan girl at heart and she was homesick. She went back and that was the end. Now it didn't coincide with the cancellation of the Arrow completely, but it came close. T-33s at Gimli. This was the jet course, of course, and the advanced flying program. After Gimli, they therefore thought it wise for us to get a survivor's course. So they had a portion of forest west of Edmonton, a place called Hinton. So we were sent there for 2 weeks to learn how to survive in the bush. Now this piece of forest that the RCAF owned, the animals had got wise to the different courses there. So although you were expected to snare rabbits and lasso squirrels, the animals got ahead of the game and they knew you were coming, so it became tough. So we were on army rations, which was reduced to half army rations after a week. When you go hungry like that, you learn quite quickly that anything that moves looks pretty exciting. This was our campfire. This was our teepee. We finished 2 weeks and it was good to get back to bacon and eggs and breakfast. I was posted to Cold Lake on the all-weather fighter, excuse me, all-weather fighter unit, and for CF-100 flying. CF-100s, of course, were very much a number of squadrons across the country at the time, and I was qualified in Cold Lake to become combat ready. We were assigned a navigator, and we practiced, first of all, dual control flying in the Mark IIIs. This is a Mark IV, which was used for all sorties with navigators. We practiced the various attack procedures that were required in the squadrons, and when we were finished, we were sent to St. Hubert, which was 416 Squadron, although there were many squadrons, as I mentioned, across the country. I had a little Porsche car. I wish I'd put it in a cardboard box and kept it, because it would be worth a lot of money today, but it was a reliable machine at the time. This is Carl Robinson, my navigator. He was a great guy, and we shared many early memories. Anyway, once I was combat ready, I was transferred to St. Hubert in Montreal, and of course Carl came with me. However, shortly after, actually, he was replaced by another navigator called Bud Taggart. Squadron leader Gagnon was my squadron commander, and Group Captain Houle was the station commander. CF-100 over the Jacques Cartier Bridge in Montreal. We used to team up occasionally with the American Scorpion airplanes that flew out of Maine. We'd sometimes conduct joint exercises. This was CF-100s on the St. Hubert flight line. The RCAF took NORAD, North American Air Defense, very seriously. We were one of several squadrons, of course, charged with preventing the Russian incursion from the north. That was the purpose of the squadrons. CF-100 aircraft were two-seated, twin-engine, subsonic aircraft with marginal speed advantage over their anticipated targets. Therefore, we required an attack program that positioned the attack aircraft at 90 degrees to the target. In other words, you couldn't catch them, so you had to come in from the side. It was called a lead collision course, or LCC. The attack aircraft was brought to the proximity of the target by ground control. Once you were sort of relatively close, the navigator in the rear seat would lock on to the target. This time you were flying towards him at right angles and ahead of him. When you got within firing range or close to it, there was a small scope in the pilot's cockpit, and he took charge of the attack run. So, watching his scope, he was flying directly at the target aircraft from the side. He'd release rockets, which were held in wingtip pods, and they would splash the target aircraft, and the attacker would fly through the debris and clear the actual airplane. In other words, he would shoot rockets ahead of the aircraft to hit it, and then he would fly behind it to clear it after it had been shot. That was an LCC program. We practiced it incessantly. It was a regular and perhaps one of our key practice missions. We put on a mess party for our group captain, and there he is. He was a fighter pilot, a Spitfire pilot actually, in World War II, and he was a pretty good guy. So he was the guy that controlled the whole airport at the time. We had a 24-hour duty cycle where we had to be on standby. This is a hangar at the end of the runway. There was an airplane parked in it. The doors were open. We used to sleep alongside it. And if we were called on a scramble, then we would be able to get airborne within minutes, because you just taxied out directly onto the runway. You can almost, I'm not sure there's a runway lights or taxiway lights under the airplane, but that's how close we were to actually taking off. So it was a quick situation to get airborne. In the summertime, we had air shows. Here's a little kid that climbed into the cockpit, and I was taking care of him for the afternoon, or whoever replaced him. We put on formation displays for the people. And in fact, it was a summer of very strong camaraderie. We had some great parties, and it was a very exciting experience to be at St. Hubert. This was my new navigator, Bud Taggart, and Bud was a great guy. He went on to remain in the Air Force for many years, and he did very well. At the end of 1961, they disbanded 416 Squadron, and this was the group. And I was posted to Trenton, which was the beginning of Air Training Command, and I was assigned to teach people how to fly Harvards. So we moved to Trenton. We were taught how to teach. Here's me trying to show people how an aileron works. And things were going quite well. We were partly through the course. But when I was in Trenton, Berlin was besieged by the Russians, and Berlin became a crisis. All CF-100 pilots that were on this course were transferred to number 4 wing at Baden-Baden. I went to number 419 Squadron, which was a CF-100 squadron at Baden-Solingen, which was a Canadian base in Germany. When we got there, the doom and gloom that had been presented wasn't apparent. Everybody was having a good time. There was nothing to do for a few days. So there were all kinds of airplanes available. So me and a few friends, we got on I think it was a Bristol freighter, and we flew to the UK for a few days. Came back to Germany at the end of the weekend, so to speak, and to see if there was any kind of action. Back in Germany, we were introduced to duty-free everything. That was from cars, gas, liquor, wine, cigarettes. There was a US PX, there was a French PX, and you name it, we had pretty well everything you bought, including gasoline, was at rock bottom prices. If I remember correctly, a carton of cigarettes cost $1. A bottle of liquor cost $1. A bottle of beer cost 10 cents. So it was tempting, to say the least. Many of the local Germans, they'd had enough of the occupying forces by the time I got there. And truthfully, they'd have been glad to see us gone. But they put up with us. And of course, we made the best of it while we could. This was a little apartment in Baden-Baden. I don't have many pictures of Germany, unfortunately. But it was quite cute. It was a very pretty part of the country. And we had a good time. In Europe, we flew CF-100 Mark IVs that were equipped with guns, not rockets. We shared the base with F-104s, and they had recently been F-86s, but the F-104s had just replaced them. So there was nothing else to do really than have simulated dogfights. So that's what we did, and it was a lot of fun, and it was very different from the atmosphere and the assignments in Canada. For the weekends, everything was available. T-33s, you could take them anywhere. It didn't matter, anywhere in Europe was good. There was plenty of fuel. There was no restriction, really, on flying, except, of course, for the East German area that we were up against and the Iron Curtain. And that was quite significant because in Europe, you know, as opposed to Canada where you could fly for 2 hours and not leave Ontario, in Europe, 5 minutes and you've crossed a national boundary. It's a completely different feeling and sensation. Plus, there were a lot of airplanes and a lot of air forces in Europe at the time. So they were all looking for some kind of combat exercise. So it was a real free-for-all, really. And occasionally you get too close to the border and you'd find Russian MiGs on your wingtips. That was relatively normal. And you tried not to cross over because you're never quite sure how ferocious they might become. But we never had any incidents other than the fact that they were there. So T-33s were available all weekends, and we took advantage of that, of course, to fly around Europe and land and take trips for the weekend. But as the Berlin crisis subsided, which took a few months, our presence in Europe became less important. And after several months, we were sent home to continue in training command. So it was back home to Moose Jaw. Instructor training on Harvards. And then I went on to Penhall in Alberta and to teach the new students how to fly the Yellow Bird. This was 1962, and the RCAF was processing a lot of local and foreign pilots. All qualified flying instructors were taught how to teach flying skills and professional behavior in accordance with the extensive experience of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. There was no leeway to incorporate your own shortcuts. Because of my squadron experience, you know, I was perfectly aware that not all squadron practices are strictly out of the book. But when you get to training command, that was all gone. They wanted you to adhere exactly to the program. And I'm sure, of course, this was due to the extensive experience of training command operating the BCATP. Just out of interest, in view of the last year's incident at Char, when Harvard made a severe swerve off the runway, we all know that Harvards have a history of sensitivity to ground loops and the like. My experience wasn't quite the same, but it was in this category. Typically, when we were flying, and of course we were teaching from the back seat, the pilot was sitting up front. Typically we conducted these 3-point landings when we fly normal flights. A little bit different sometimes in formation flying when we do rolling landings, but normally we did 3-point. A nice student came in high, and I was a bit slow to correct him. The Harvards stalled too high off the runway. When they do this, I found they bounce from one wheel and wingtip to the other wheel and wingtip and damage both wingtips. By this time, of course, I had full power on, and we were going around trying to avoid the stall, which I failed to. So I took off and we did a circuit and came in and landed uneventfully. Anyway, I was called up by my boss. He said, look, I don't really, I understand students sometimes misbehave themselves, but you had enough runway to stop, and you shouldn't have gone around. Therefore, you're a bad boy. Anyway, he was very understanding beyond that. But I sort of put this down to the experience, again, of the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. They'd seen all these things before. There was nothing that we did that they hadn't seen before. They knew what to predict and how to cope. So they were constantly reminding you of the result of those years when the BCATP had been such a success. 403, a group on 415. I would like to see the RCAF as robust today as it was in the early 1960s. In total, these years were some of the best in my life, and I was pleased and proud that CHAA has helped me remember and relive them. If I had the money and the vigor, I would grab a pilot's license and join the CHAA pilots. As it is, maybe I'll just buy a motorcycle and carry on. Or perhaps I'll join my old 416 Squadron, which is now operating, I believe, out of Cold Lake with CF-18s. And I'll just fly into the distance. Thank you very much.
John, that was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, love those experiences, my goodness.
Thank you very much.
You flew in the glory days of the Royal Canadian Air Force.
Yes,
You know,
they were glory days.
The 50s and the 60s were
so.
unparalleled in Canadian aviation history. You know,
I think so. Because they were exciting but free.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You guys had some amazing experiences in Europe.
And there was still money in the kitty.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing with us this morning.
Thank you, Pat.
It's been a really